is 10 a.m. Mountain Time. Appreciate everyone joining us for WECC's Resource Adequacy Discussion Series. I am Travis English, WECC's Senior Training and Outreach Specialist. Thanks for joining us for the discussion series where we'll be talking about transmission considerations. First, I'm going to highlight an event that we have coming up this fall, October 31st through November 1st in San Diego, California. It's a reliability and security workshop. It's a 2-day workshop that will be hosted in San Diego, and it is CMEP focused. So hopefully you can mark your calendars. We will put some more information in the chat, how you can register for that. Take a quick look at WECC's antitrust policy. All WECC meetings are conducted in accordance with the WECC antitrust policy and the NERC antitrust compliance guidelines. All participants must comply with the policy and guidelines. This meeting is public. Confidential or proprietary information should not be discussed in the open session. This webinar is also being recorded and it will be posted publicly. By participating, you give your consent for your name, voice, image, and likeness to be included in that recording. WECC strives to ensure the information presented today is accurate and reflects the views of WECC. However, all interpretations and positions are subject to change. If you have questions, please contact our legal counsel. Now I would like to turn it over to Chris Raper. She is WECC's Vice President of Strategic Engagement and External Affairs here. Chris, take it away.
Thanks, Travis. Thanks, everyone. Happy to see everyone online this morning. Really happy to have this panel. And really, my only role here today, other than maybe a backup for Branden, who I know will do a great job as moderator, is to let y'all know that we've been doing this RA series for about a year, or no, maybe close to 2 years now. And while resource adequacy is a really important subject with reliability across the country and in North America, there are so many other considerations that affect reliability. And so we are going to transition. We feel like we've exhausted a lot of the subject matter for resource adequacy, and we can come back to it as often as we need, but we're going to transition a little bit away from that and just sort of pick up whatever the current and most highlighted considerations are regarding reliability. But as for today's panel, transmission is inextricably linked to resource adequacy and the considerations for the grid now and going forward, and what we need to be resource adequate. So with that, I will pass things over to Branden Sudduth and allow him to introduce the panel and the specific subjects of today's discussion.
Great, thank you, Chris. And just to reemphasize what Chris said, today we will be focusing on transmission considerations as they relate to resource adequacy. But in the last couple of years, transmission has really made a lot of waves, transmission development, expansion. And as such, there are a lot of different efforts currently going on. So sometimes it's hard to kind of keep track of all of the conversations, of all of the different actions by different groups happening. And just to kind of give you a little sample of some of the things that you might be aware of, in 2022 we saw some NOPRs coming out of FERC, some specific to transmission planning and others related to different parts of the transmission planning process. We've seen a lot of studies being initiated both at very local levels as well as at the national level, looking at different opportunities for transmission expansion. Over the past several years now, we've experienced significant extreme weather events that have really got us thinking about the importance of transmission and being able to leverage wide area geographical diversity to help overcome some of the effects of things like heat waves and cold snaps. We've seen more and more variability as the system itself, the generation mix changes, and with that variability, there has been a lot of discussion around utilizing transmission more to help alleviate some of that variability from a wide area perspective. And just for your awareness, currently in the Western Interconnection, we have 36 registered planning coordinators, many more registered transmission planners. We have 3 FERC Order 1000 regional planning groups, and the list goes on and on of different entities that are involved in different planning efforts. And we're going to talk about some of those today. And so with that, I'd like to introduce our panelists. So from WECC, we have Saad Malik. He is our Director of Reliability Assessments. And Saad has been very engaged in the Interregional Transfer Capability Study that was mandated by Congress back in June through executive order. We've got Adria Brooks. She is a Senior Technical Advisor in the Transmission Division of the U.S. Department of Energy. And we've got Jason Fuller, who is a Principal Research Engineer, Electricity Infrastructure and Buildings Design for PNNL. And so with that, I'm going to give each of the panelists just a few minutes just to give kind of a brief overview of some of the transmission planning efforts that they're involved in, the different study efforts. And then we're going to ask the panelists some questions to hopefully generate some discussion around this topic. So with that, let's go ahead and start with Saad. Saad, we'll go ahead and start with you.
Yeah, thank you, Branden. Good morning, everyone. I guess I'll start off with some of the assessments that we do here at WECC. WECC performs several reliability assessments. That's one of the delegated functions from NERC that we perform. I oversee a team of analysts and engineers that perform a number of different assessments in power flow, stability, production cost modeling, probabilistic models to perform assessments. We have a couple of tracks along which we perform assessments. One is the support of NERC's annual reliability assessments, such as the long-term reliability assessment, winter, summer assessments. And then additionally, we also have a study program that we engage our stakeholders with via the study subcommittee, where we look at what other reliability issues are on the minds of our stakeholders that we could highlight through our assessment work. Over the last few years, we've mostly been focused on resource adequacy for obvious reason, and then with the changing resource mix, inverter-based resources have been a big focus area for us as well. And last year, we got an action item from the board to perform a gap analysis on transmission planning to identify what are the challenges. So we did a lot of work there. We wrote several papers on that topic. And we held a workshop last year where we invited industry experts on transmission planning. So there have been several activities that we've been engaged with and started over the last year or so. As part of our analysis work, we're doing an interconnection-wide transmission trends assessment. We're doing several year 20 assessments this year. We have just kicked off the long-term planning task force that is working with a number of different stakeholders on long-term planning. And as Branden mentioned, the interregional transfer capability study is also a big focus for us for this year, as that's a study mandated by the Congress to NERC, and NERC is now engaging with all the regions on performing that assessment. So there's a lot of exciting work, a lot of a number of different assessments and other work that's happening here at WECC on this topic.
Great, thank you, Saad. And Adria, Jason, I know there is a ton of work going on at the DOE and the national labs. Please just provide us a few minutes. I know you could probably fill a couple of days just providing overviews of all the different work that's going on, but we're really glad that you're able to join us, and look forward to hearing a little bit about some of the work that you've got going on. So let's go ahead and start with Adria.
Thank you, Branden. Thank you, WECC, for having me here today. So as was said, I'm a senior technical advisor in transmission planning for the Grid Deployment Office at DOE. Been with the department for about 3 years now. We have several transmission studies ongoing. The two that I'll note today at a high level, and then I'll go into more details on one of them later, is a national transmission planning study, and then also the very similarly named National Transmission Needs Study. Two separate studies, both touch on resource adequacy to an extent. I'll just note quickly in terms of bio, prior to joining DOE, I was a transmission engineer with the Wisconsin Public Service Commission. I also received my master's and PhD in power systems engineering from the University of Wisconsin. And then for a Western connection, I got started in the energy industry over a decade ago when I was working alongside Tucson Electric Power's staff and their solar power test yard they have set up there in Tucson. And then just a quick disclaimer, although I'm going to be sharing lots of DOE resources today, my opinions are my own and do not reflect that of the department or the secretary. I'll pass back to you, Branden.
Great, thanks, Adria. And I'll go ahead and pass it to you, Jason.
Thank you. I appreciate being here today. As a national lab, we get a kind of unique perspective on some of these things. We get to work on some very exciting problems, and but in the end, we don't have to. We're not dependent on reliability. So, in that way, we are able to look at other things. We're able to explore kind of outside the boundaries a little bit, and that makes the partnerships with WECC and other agencies a lot more interesting in the way that we can attack these things. So, Adria mentioned a couple like the National Transmission Plan and others that PNL participates on to try to help develop some of those models and run those scenarios. But we also do things like offshore wind studies, where we're looking at how to increase the penetration of offshore wind. How do we plan for, when will that be available in the next 10 to 15 years, or will our transmission system be ready to absorb it? We're able to look at things like hydro water availability. So we have tools that are able to look at hydro today and at what it looks like in the system, but then also look forward 15 to 20 years, understanding how climate is going to impact our water flows and our snowpacks, and start to help understand what that kind of 15 to 20 year projection starts to look like. And so I think Branden hit on it, really, really well, that these two things, resource adequacy and transmission, are they're linked together. We can't separate the two of them. If you're going to build a highly renewable future, we have to build something else to go along with it. That is most likely large-scale transmission that allows us to move things around the region and really capture some of that wide area geographic diversity that we're looking for. And so, as we start to think about that, not only in today's weather patterns, but also thinking about what does weather look like 10, 20, 30 years from now, as we start to think about how extreme weather and even normal weather patterns change over the next decades. How is that going to impact water flows? How does that impact thermal ratings on plants? How does that impact where the resources are available? The way to, one of the main ways to kind of combat that is to have the ability to lean on your neighbors, which requires more transmission. And so as we start to think about these things, we don't want to forget about, the way that we have invested in the past has always had energy equity and justice as part of it, but we want to make that a more and a greater emphasis. And so how do we start to bring some of those tools and capabilities to various entities, make sure that you understand what those investments mean and who are impacted by them and who gets the most benefits. So in that way, we're able to, as a national lab, try to provide some of those tools and data and capabilities. And so I'm excited to share more about those as we go forward.
Great, thank you, Jason. And I will just remind the audience, if you do have any questions for the panelists, please put those in the chat. And we'll have people reviewing those and passing those questions along. So please enter your questions into the chat. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into questions. And Jason, you really started to dig into this a little bit in your introduction. But just curious from Saad and Adria's perspective, what are some of the biggest transmission concerns or considerations with regards to resource adequacy? And I know in the past, a lot of the times we treat the two separately, but with the pace of change in the system, it almost seems like you can't really separate the two anymore. They need to be considered together. So if you could speak to some of those transmission concerns or considerations with regards to resource adequacy.
Adria, you want to go first, or you want me to?
Sure, I'll take it.
Yep.
Yeah, I think Jason did a really good job of pointing out kind of the two big issues that we see. But just to highlight again that resource adequacy is predominantly a generation concern. The issue, though, is that as we're seeing extreme weather events change, and as we see the grid transformation, we really need greater access to both the diversity of resources and larger geographic footprint of the same resource. And the only way to do that now is to expand the transmission system, either with actual new lines or just expanding the capacity of the existing system. So those are really the things. you can think, for example, that weather events, they can affect an entire fleet of generators in local area. So you can think about coal piles freezing up during extreme cold events in an area. Of course, it's easy to envision like a weather system or a storm system clouding over solar panels in a given area, right? So if you have a larger geographic diversity, even of just those same resources, you're going to have better resource adequacy results. And then again, that larger resource diversity. So you don't want just solar and wind, right? You're going to want gas, hydropower, nuclear. The more diversity you have, the better, because these extreme events don't necessarily impact all generation resources the same way. And again, the way to gain that resource diversity is to have a more expanded transmission system. Saad, anything you'd like to add?
Sure. Yeah. No, I agree with Jason and you have said. I mean, I think if you look at in the context, the current transmission has been built around the resources that we had in the past, and now as the resource mix is changing, those new resources are going to potentially going into locations where we didn't have a whole lot of transmission. So that in itself builds the speaks for the need for new transmission, and not only just the new transmission, but ensuring that there's enough transfer capability exists in that transmission, so that when things are tough, that transfer capability is available. And that's kind of what the driver was with the ITCS study as well. The biggest challenges I see is the bottoms up approach. I mean, we've said that many times, is that planning the system you have resources on the one hand, you have transmission on the other hand, planning the system in a coordinated, holistic manner, and then also planning it in larger geographic footprints as opposed to local planning. And that's where the diversity of resources can be studied appropriately, as well as Adria was talking about. Adding more resources, I think that was a really good point, that adding more resources, especially wind and solar, at the same location, there are diminishing returns with that. As you add more wind and solar at the same spot, if there's a cloud cover, adding more solar at the same location isn't going to help. So that's where geographic diversity is really critical, because then and then with that geographic diversity, you need to have then transmission to support that as well, and the transfer capability that goes with it. So yeah, I think those are some of the key items that I would say are important as we plan and operate the system.
Now, this is very interesting, because you've all brought up kind of different points about the future. We're trying to plan for extreme weather events. We've got a changing resource mix that is largely affected by different types of weather patterns. And I know the three of you are very close to the studies. You're study focused technical people. Just kind of curious, as we start to think about the future, there's a lot of uncertainty around the types of weather events that we might experience, around what resources might be available. And lately we've been hearing a lot about load uncertainty as well, due to things like electrification and massive load, like data centers loads coming onto the grid, that kind of change a lot of the dynamics of systems. So with all of that uncertainty, how has that affected the way that you study the grid, the way that you think about transmission expansion, and probably more specifically, how has that affected the way that you think about like large interregional transmission projects?
What's that one first? I guess I could jump in a little bit there. I think you're right. There is a lot of uncertainty in some of these things, and seems like every day there's more uncertainty from every single direction. But I think when we start to look at these large scenarios and look at the way that they start to unfold, you start to see some common characteristics, right? That they say things like you will need transmission lines between these regions, you will need, more generation in this region and things like that. And so, sometimes we kind of get a little bit stuck on the weeds on some of those things about whether this scenario is different than this scenario, but it's the commonalities that are important, and those are the things that we want to focus on and be able to say, those are the things we just know we need to do. And one of those, like I think you kind of were mentioning there, is really the interregional transmission, right? That's something that we haven't done a lot of in the last few decades. We've done pretty good on the regional transmission upgrades and moving forward with those, but some of these big interregional transfers between different areas, especially that getting back to that geographical diversity, that's something we haven't done. So we already know we're behind on those investments anyway. And so those are some of those things that I think that are, I won't say they're easy wins because they are hard problems to tackle, but we know we need them. And so that's something that as a nation, I think, it's something that we can make a decision to say we need to build those.
I can jump in on some of the wider studies. So as a department, right, we're able to look at the entire US when we do our planning studies or our need assessment studies, which is unique than what Saad or those who are actually on the ground who are doing the work get to do. So as a result of doing that, we are able to get a better view of what are the interregional needs, and does provide a little bit more of a holistic look, hoping that the results of these various studies would be useful and can be pulled in by the utilities or by the planning entities that are actually doing the work. That is, of course, our goal. And then I'll also add, this is not unique to transmission, this is just true for all systems, but Jason touched on scenario development and trying to move towards including more scenarios in our assessments is really valuable. We don't do a lot of scenario-based modeling work when we do transmission planning or we do resource adequacy planning. There's a little bit of that, but it's usually based in historical data. It's not even based in like changes that we know are coming down the road, given climatic changes or weather changes or just the power sector changing. So being able to include more probabilistic or more scenarios in our analysis is going to help a lot, both on the generation, load, and transmission side.
Yeah, and I'll add. I mean, I agree both with what Jason was saying and Adria as well. That when we did start the work after we got the action item from our board on the challenges with transmission planning, we kind of looked at the challenges in two buckets. So one bucket was the technical challenges, and then the other was kind of in the business challenge side of things. It was interesting, and it was quite evident that there, and like you mentioned, Branden, that there's a lot of uncertainty. The issue with transmission, the large interregional transmission projects, is that it takes 15-20 years to plan and build that transmission. So if entities know that whatever they're going to build, they're not gonna, or whatever they're gonna plan is not gonna get built for another 15 to 20 years, then that requires a different mindset. And that's something that historically, people involved in planning, they've been in that 5 to 10 year planning thinking historically. And that's one of the reasons that we've seen that FERC had with their NOPR last year. They are proposing to change the interregional transmission planning processes to look at more 20-year out. So that brings a lot of uncertainty. Now it's a challenge to plan for the system 10 years out. Now 20 years out, the uncertainty is even at a greater level. So that's where like Adria was mentioning, that planning for different types of scenarios is really critical, and there is a model already out there, and when we did our workshop last year, the MISO's MVP process is a model, and a lot of the FERC NOPR was also using some of that and kind of refers to it as kind of the model. And what they have shared with us when we invited them to our workshop was that they'll look at the bookends. So different assumptions. You have the loads, you have resources, you have the electrification. So they look at those bookends and for a number of different factors. And then they see which transmission projects are showing up as the in a lot of those scenarios, or if not all, and which ones are you know are going to be the most beneficial. So that's, you know, so building those data sets, having a different kind of mindset, being okay with uncertainty into that 20-year future. I mean, we as engineers, we like to know everything, that you know, be certain about things before we plan for anything. And so this is a different way of thinking, is that, you know, being okay with that uncertainty and trying to come up with processes that deal with that uncertainty.
No, thank you all. Oh, go ahead, Chris, please.
Sorry, Brandon. I was just going to ask a follow-up to Saad on that, and he probably can anticipate because he and I talk enough about these things. But I'm curious because you say 20-year studies are notoriously unreliable, which it makes sense that they would be, right? You just can't, we don't know what's going to happen 20 years from now. 20 years ago, we couldn't have anticipated where we're at right now, for resource adequacy and need for transmission. And so how do you do that then? Because there's a spectrum upon which transmission is necessary, right? Some people think less is needed, some people think more is needed. So there's a spectrum of how much. And then there's the uncertainty of 20-year planning, but we know that we have to do it because it takes a long time to get transmission built. So where's a happy medium in there? I mean, is there an obvious answer to that I'm not seeing, or is it as confusing as it is in my head?
I mean, you're absolutely right, and you know, we've heard time and again from stakeholders. This is something new that in planning we're stepping into. We're getting a little bit of push from FERC on this because they're, you know, based on the NOPR and some of the direction that they're going. But really there is a model out there, like I was mentioning, that MISO's MVP process that looks at not only the 10-year future, but it also looks at the 20-year future. And then the 20-year future, you look at the number of different factors. And it's kind of, and WECC has actually done some of this work in the past as well. We had a scenario working group that was doing that. They were building a number of different scenarios that far out. So it's using some of that experience from our past work, some of the tweaks that, or some of the learnings from the others who have done it in the industry. And now we have a task force, actually the long-term transmission planning task force, that, you know, part of it is their job, is that how do we do it for the West? You know, especially creating those scenarios. What kind of scenarios are going to be needed? So really, you know, what we've learned from others who have done this is that you build those scenarios, a number of different scenarios that you think are plausible. You look at, and each scenario perhaps represents a certain data sets that you analyze. And then in those analysis, you look at which transmission needs are coming up again and again and again. So you know that, okay, we've looked at a number of different futures that we could see happening in 20 years out. We don't know which one is going to happen, but we know that out of the ones that we've looked at, majority of them show there's a transmission need over here, and then you plan for that. And then you repeat that process, you know, periodically, every couple of years or something of that nature, so that you consistently, you can see whether that's the trajectory that you're getting into the future or not.
Thank you, Saad.
And I actually have a kind of a follow-up question to that as well. And, you know, from the way that Saad is describing it sounds like we're able to do this today. You know, we talked a lot about extreme weather events, 20-year planning, uncertainty, the scenarios. But my question is more general. Do we have the analytical and planning tools to be able to do this type of analysis and do it effectively, especially considering that nexus between transmission planning and resource planning?
I would argue that we are starting to be able to do these things. So this is something, you know, I think back to Chris's question is, 15 years ago, you asked us this, we didn't have the computation capabilities, we didn't have the data, we didn't have the tools. This is an emerging area for us, and it's really exciting to see it. Right now, one of the biggest challenges is actually trying to gather the data that goes into these things to say, what are the different spreads of the scenarios that you want to look at? What are the axes that you want to explore? Do you want to look at full wind and solar integration 100%, or do you want to look at carbon capture technologies? That's a relatively easy one. What if you want to look at different climate scenarios versus 2.5 versus 5.5 degrees change, and all the ranges in between? And so I think sometimes that can be a little bit of basically a stopping point for people, where they say, oh, I just can't make the choices. Like, I don't understand where to get started. And so I think my encouragement is that, say, you pick the ones that you understand and work with those, and then you add to it as you move forward. More importantly, I think as we're starting to see some of the computational resources that are starting to be built around these things, you look at the industry tools that we use today, they're really deterministic models. But we're writing code around those that turn them into more probabilistic representations. That takes time, it takes verification, it takes looking back and understanding where we got it wrong. But I think we're making some really great progress in the industry right now.
Yeah, and Jason, if I could pull on that string just a little bit, we actually received a question in the chat very similar to what you were just talking about with the difference between deterministic and probabilistic studies. And the question is, for transmission to save the day by allowing us to lean on our neighbors, we need to know how much is there. While WECC and others are encouraging probabilistic resource adequacy modeling that looks at every single hour, transmission models are largely limited to studying limited numbers of periods, perhaps 2 or 4 per year. And these transmission studies tend to focus on n-1 or n-2, not some probabilistically determined future. How do we appropriately determine probabilistically defined transmission availability for every hour in our resource adequacy analysis?
I see Adria nodding her head. I don't know if you want to take a crack at that one first.
Sure, happy to. I was going to jump on what you were saying before, Jason, but the department has been encouraging the labs and funding for the labs to really develop a lot of these tools so that they can be accessible to the wider public. Of course, there's a lot of benchmarking that needs to be done of lab tool outcomes and then what the industry is used to using in terms of their software. But in our national transmission planning study, we're working with both NREL and PNNL to develop some of these tools. And we're really engaged with industry to be sure that they understand how the tools are being used and how they themselves could use them in the future. But to that point, even the last year, the labs have been making almost those exact changes, where instead of just looking at a couple of time slices, they're now looking at being able to do this almost hourly. So we can do capacity expansion modeling on an hourly basis. We can do probabilistic resource adequacy on an hourly basis. The labs have huge computers where they're able to do this. This wouldn't necessarily be doable by every single utility, but for utilities to team up with the labs to be able to use their tools or to help understand kind of what are the lessons learned from our studies, looking at this at a national level, and then how can you take those learnings and apply them locally. That's something that we hope that we can expand upon. And I'll drop a link in the chat or ask Travis to do it too. In August 1st, we had a public webinar on the National Transmission Planning Study where we outlined some of the changes that we've been making to our tools as a result of this study, specifically on the resource adequacy. So I'll drop in the chat now for folks.
Well, thank you, Adria.
Yeah, I'll add that, one of some of the things that we've looked at, from a probabilistic perspective is outage data. And we have the benefit at WECC that we receive the GADs and the TAD, like the generation outage data, transmission outage data. So we try to incorporate some probabilistics from that into our analysis. So that's one avenue that we've looked at. But I know that a lot of that data is confidential. So there's challenges there for others to be able to use that. Going back to your original question, Branden, on do we have the tools? I think I agree with Jason that we're just beginning to explore this and finding that there's a lot of challenges with analysis, and that's where some of the work that labs have done, national labs have done, has been helpful in terms of tool development. We've also worked with our vendors on some of the things that we've learned on the analysis that we've done to then help them, especially in the the storage space, being able to analyze energy storage. That's been one of the challenges for us, and we've talked to our vendors to help us with that, and that's one of the discussions we've had with some of the labs as well. I think there's other considerations as well. For example, if you look at the FERC NOPR from last year on interregional transmission planning, one of the things that they have identified is use of dynamic transmission line ratings in the long-term assessments. So that's another consideration that we need to have as to how do we do that. And currently, there is some way of doing that, but I think there's more needs to be done in that regard as well. And then, yes, I mean, we currently, from WECC perspective, we build the 10-year out data sets, like the anchor data set, we call it, on the production cost models. And then, yeah, we have the power flow and stability models for 10 years out. But the discussion that we are having with our stakeholders in the long-term transmission planning task force is that how do we build the year 20 data sets that are interconnection wide, representing a number of different future base scenarios, which then the transmission planners can then use, or planning coordinators, they can use in their analysis work, so that for whatever scenarios they want to run. So.
Great, thank you. And I see we're starting to get a lot of questions coming through the chat, but kind of one follow-up question to some of the things that we've heard. From a planner's perspective, a lot of the times we use historical information and then project that out into the future to try and help us determine what we need to plan to. However, just based on the unprecedented change on the system, as well as, these extreme weather events that seem to kind of break the trends that we've seen in the past, how do we account for that degree of uncertainty in the future, where maybe we can't rely on historical information to help us determine what might happen in the future? Are there tools available to us? And you can speak specifically to maybe load forecasting or something like that, but just kind of curious, how do we overcome that challenge of using historical information and looking more to an uncertain future?
I'll just plug, so the same slides that I just dropped into the chat, as part of the National Transmission Planning Study, we are relying on lab and NOAA forecasts of weather and climate changes into the future to really look at stress cases in 3 scenarios. So heat wave impacts, cold wave impacts, so the opposite, right? And then drought impacts, which is obviously most important out in the West. So those are the 3 kind of stress cases that we've seen have a huge impact on the power system, even recent years. So we're projecting what those changes are going to be out forward, looking at climate models to try to adjust the assumptions that go into our resource adequacy and reliability stress analysis cases. So that's something that we're working with, and then the way that we do that, as well as the findings as a result of stress cases, will be made public after we're done with that modeling, but we're kind of in the process of modeling it now.
And I'll say, one of the big things is like climate change folks. They've done a phenomenal job kind of modeling out what the system's going to look like. But when you look at that data, it's almost useless for transmission or utility usage. So a lot of the work that's been going on right now is trying to make that translation to downscale from these big climate cell models down to what does that mean to a local region. I know the Grid Modernization Lab Consortium out of DOE is just about to announce projects, but basically they're funding a whole thread on how to make those models available to utilities so that you can have data that's useful for planning. So, this again an evolving area, but I think in the next 2 years you're going to see a lot of movement in this area.
And Branden, I think from our perspective, what we've done in the past, I mean, we've used probabilistics to to see, based on history, what do we learn, or what could we expect? What are the worst case scenarios? And by expected, I don't mean 50-50, but they going beyond that, like maybe 95th percentile or 90th percentile, those kind of scenarios. So that tells us, gives us a foundation to build on. But then as Adria and Jason were saying, that then you go to the scenarios. Okay, what does the scenario look like? A particular scenario will do to the system. So so you use a little bit of a deterministic approach there as well, along with the probabilistic, to then get the full breadth of what to expect. So I mean, that's kind of, not relying on one or the other, or tossing one out because that's no good and then only using the other, but it's like a combination of the two, I think is some of the techniques that we've used in the past and will look to for future assessments.
Great, thank you. And thanks for the heads up on the climatology models too, informing some of the data going forward. Looking forward to getting access to some of that information. So thank you. Another audience question: can the panel address the expanding use of demand side management and distributed generation used by power companies, and how integrating that in with transmission, and how to integrate that in with transmission planning at the regional level?
I mean, I could start. I mean, we've done an assessment. I think that's a very good point that we need to consider. And we did an assessment, I think it was 2 years ago, perhaps now, where we looked at the impact of distributed energy resources on the system. And we did find that there was an impact beyond a certain level. I think it was, beyond, like, if you have like 9%, 8-9%, then you start to see on the transmission side the impacts of both, in terms of the shaving off the peak demand, and then also once the sun goes down, that spike in load as well. So the generation then having to pick that up. So there's two sides to that as well. So I mean, we've done some work on it. It's again, if you look at in the context of 20 years out, there's a lot of, again, uncertainty built to it. But yeah, definitely something that we do see that in our forecast, that people or entities, the balancing authorities that submit us the data, they do incorporate some of that in there, so we take that into consideration. But I think that that's an area that needs to continue to be explored, and then also understood a little bit more than where we're at today.
Can I ask a question to tag onto that, and not just for Saad, but the other two panelists as well, that has to do with demand response and demand side management? And that would be that as loads are flattening, right, we used to have utilities who had peaks. And so the demand side management or demand and response programs were meant to flatten out those peaks in order to be able to provide that energy. Is there anything to the thought that as loads flatten, whether it be because people are working from home or whatever, right? People are charging their cars at different hours in order to flatten the load, that those programs may not be as successful as they have in the past at meeting that resource need?
I mean, I think, one of the challenges we have, so a lot of those programs are designed around, rates, time of use rates, or phone calls, even, like, or message alerts and things like that. The challenge with that was, well, that worked well because we had a very regulated system, right? We knew when the peak was going to be, we knew what generations were online, we knew when people were going to come home. We basically, in the last 10 years, taken that, throw it up in the air and said, hey, guess what? We're going to try something different. People are going to charge their cars when they come home, but they may not cook dinner anymore, right? May go out to a dinner instead. Renewables are changing the balance of mix in terms of, when would we ever have seen a 9 p.m. peak in a utility before, right? And so, the challenge with it, then having all these kind of really relatively simple time of use programs or even messaging programs, meant that you're not adaptable to those new changes. And so I think if we are going to rely on this demand side management, things like that, we have to get a little bit more complicated about it. We have to think about how do we adapt to different scenarios? How do we engage those resources on a continuous basis to look at, every day shaving a little bit off rather than saying only the 10 days that we're worried about. And so I think we're gonna have to adapt a little bit and look at some of these more interactive programs that allow customers to be part of the solution rather than necessarily kind of just there on the 2 days that we get really excited about.
Thank you, Jason. Got a question. I think Saad brought up energy storage earlier in one of his comments, but I have a question about energy storage. What are the roles of batteries and storing energy from renewable resources? How do we consider the role of those versus building interregional transmission in these studies?
I can touch on that a little bit. In some studies of resource adequacy, again, looking kind of broader besides just like a local region, two of the things that really impact resource adequacy access, the ability to maintain resource adequacy, is the use of battery storage and the use of expanded transmission systems. So there really is a positive impact to using battery storage to help with resource adequacy. I can dig up some papers on this and pass on to you all afterwards to share that talk about this more, but in general, a positive impact from battery storage.
I think especially coupled with long duration energy storage, I think some of the gap right now is on some of that longer energy storage and how to address that over kind of a seasonal time frame.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I agree with that. I mean, I think there is definitely definitely resource adequacy benefit with storage. Some of our assessments, we've seen that with storage and coupled with wind and solar, there is benefit. You start to see the benefit, but once you cross a certain threshold, there is diminishing benefit. So that the last 20% or 25% of capacity or energy, I should say, that is really a big question mark at this point. As to if you look at, especially when you look at the 20 years out, and some of the policies that are driving towards a very aggressive, like 100% renewable kind of a time frame. I think there's benefit, but at a certain point there is and I think Adria had mentioned in the beginning that you really have to look at your entire portfolio. There is a role for for all kinds of resources to play in the future for us. And then it really needs to be studied as a portfolio, and transmission is part of that portfolio. The demand response is part of that portfolio. The DERs are part of that portfolio. So that entire portfolio makes a solution work, and being able to understand and study. It's not one silver bullet and that's going to take us to the next level. It's really looking at that entire system comprehensively at a holistic level.
Great. Thank you, Saad. And you brought up policy changes and thinking about how policy changes impact interregional transmission planning. My question is, how can we engage policymakers as we do these different types of studies? How can we better engage them in the process?
I'll plug a couple things quickly as it relates also to a message that Travis put in the chat a few minutes ago. So earlier in the summer, the department released a study on improvements to resource adequacy. The target audience for here is policymakers. So what are changes that could be made at the state level or local level for you all in order to increase resource adequacy in your regions? There's a long list of improvements that are suggested here, some of which we've touched on, such as including better climate models into the weather data that's used, looking at scenario modeling. But I'll highlight the two that are related to transmission. So sorry, Brandon, getting a little further away from your question, but I just want to make sure I get these in before the end. The two that are related to transmission are that first, that the resource adequacy models should consider transmission congestion and outages during adequacy assessments. A lot of resource adequacy assessments just assume that the transmission system is going to be available at its full capacity, which of course the same weather events that could take out generation could also take out transmission or could increase congestion on the system. So that is a small change that has been shown to have a really high impact on the accuracy of assessments. And then one that's a little bit more forward thinking, and again, we touched on this a bit, so I won't really get into it, but just to name that trying to co-optimize transmission, generation, and load when doing resource adequacy assessments has a really big impact, because right now, if we're only looking at generation optimization and we're ignoring the transmission system, we might miss a more reliable, a least cost solution that we just are going to miss if we don't do that co-optimization. So I'll just leave it there and then turn it back if others want to address the question.
I may not answer your question directly here, Branden, but I think we talked a lot about some of the technical issues that go into this. I think some of the issues that we also have are around business functions, about who gets allocated certain costs around some of these upgrades, and how that's done. I think there's some needs around some of the policy changes to enable these to move faster, because a lot of these questions don't get held up in the technical. Those studies can be done relatively quickly, to 15 years. But a lot of these things get held up in trying to understand who gets what benefits from it, who gets allocated the certain costs for it, whose land is it going to go over, and other siting and other type of issues like that. And so I don't know the answer to that. I'll be honest, that's not my area, but I think that's the biggest limitation right now and the biggest hold up on some of those big plans.
Jason, can I ask a question related to that answer? And that is, do the labs have a position on whether portfolio over project is the way to go on that, or do they stay out of that entirely?
As a lab, we stay out of any opinions, really. But no, I mean, honestly, I think personally, the portfolio analysis is a much better approach in terms of understanding what are the different combinations of things that would benefit the region, or in this case, the nation, better.
And maybe, I'll add that, on the policy front, the big thing that I see on the horizon, or is the from a FERC perspective, we had the NOPR from last year that has basically, they say in the NOPR that Order 1000 has not produced the results that FERC was expecting. That process didn't produce those results. So they're expected some changes to that. When we will see what that order looks like when it comes to pass, and then from how do I engage how do we engage stakeholders? I mean, I call Chris on the policymaker side, and we communicate with them and try to answer their questions as we do our assessment. I mean, that's one of the things that we have incorporated our analysis, is that when we do the report, I mean, it's one thing to do a lot of the good technical work, but then when we do our messaging and report writing, we make sure that it's addressing the questions that all the stakeholders have, including the policymakers. So that's part of our approach that we've used.
Thank you. It looks like we have time for probably one more question, and I realize there's some questions that we're not going to be able to get to on today's webinar, but this question has to do with offshore wind. And the question is, are the current resource adequacy modeling efforts, and I would expand that to say transmission planning as well, factoring in any developments in offshore wind and accompanying transmission?
So I can speak from the lab perspective, but which would not include what the utilities are doing themselves. But GDO has actually worked with a number of the labs to do an offshore wind study to kind of understand what it would take to reach some of the administration goals to get to, say, I think it's, I want to say it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 gigawatts on the East Coast and 30 gigawatts on the West Coast of offshore wind, and really look at those kind of, I call it the true costs. So understanding what it does to, what are the upgrades that are required on the onshore transmission system to really meet those objectives. That's the West Coast one, just got kicked off a few months ago. The East Coast one is just wrapping up this December.
Great, thank you, Jason.
Can add a little bit more to that about the offshore wind study. So two things that really stood out to me, and I haven't been directly involved in those studies themselves, but having just like heard about the results as they're coming in, there were two things related to resource adequacy and transmission planning that really stood out. The first one is that with offshore wind, it's really important that we do look at a portfolio of projects with transmission planning, doing kind of one-off transmission projects to each set of wind generators offshore can really stress the onshore transmission system. So this is one where kind of comprehensive transmission planning can be really important. And then the second detail that stood out to me related to resource adequacy is that offshore wind potential is really stable. It doesn't have quite the same variability and daily fluctuations as what we see with onshore wind. So it is just a much stronger resource. It doesn't have a lot of those implications that we see with wind onshore. So even though they're both wind, you can think about them almost different in how they relate to resource adequacy or their generation provided.
Great, thank you. And I think that brings us to the end of our webinar. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Travis to kind of close us out.
Great, Brandon. Thank you so much for walking us through that discussion there. And to our panelists, Adria Brooks and Saad, Malik, and Jason Fuller, appreciate you guys taking the time out of your day to come and join us and share with us. Just want to tell everyone to mark your calendars for next month. On October 5th will be our next discussion that we'll be hosting. It again will be at 10 o'clock Mountain Time. We'll be discussing inverter-based resources. So hope you can join us then. Again, thank you to our participants for joining, and hope everyone has a great day today. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.